Mainstream is often a term of derision in hobbyist circles because it suggests a lack of knowledge or sophistication, the kind of thing that anyone can enjoy regardless of how invested they are in the deep discourse. You can't feel all clever and superior if you enjoy the same thing as everyone else. There is a pressure to feel above the pedestrian pleasures of the most popular game or movie or music. That line of thinking is all centered around a consumer's ego, what they feel a piece of media says about them. It doesn't interact at all with the simple, obvious truth that crafting a piece of media that actually does appeal to mostly everyone is insanely hard work that pays off unpredictably. For every Taylor Swift-style success story, there are countless copycats that are chasing the same vibe and structure under the assumption that if it works for one creator, it could work for anyone, and are left wondering what the hell happened when popular culture passes them by when they followed the same formula to differing results. There is no formula to mainstream success that is guaranteed to work. So when something actually does become that successful, so mainstream as to be ubiquitous, it's worth swallowing the impulse to be superior and catty about it. Horizon Forbidden West is not a revolutionary game in any way. Everything it does has been done before, not just in Zero Dawn, but in dozens on dozens of open-world titles of varying quality. It is unique, however, in its mood, style, and rhythm. In all of those categories, it is relentlessly fun and satisfying. It takes its own world seriously, despite being kind of preposterous at times, and in doing so establishes a brand identity that builds on Zero Dawn but eclipses it completely in scale and confidence. Forbidden West is, in many ways, an entry-level game designed to entice new players as a PlayStation Store centerpiece, somewhere people can start when they first buy a PlayStation and are wondering what now to do with it. Its art style is cinematic and lush, pushing the hardware and demonstrating the value of the hardware, justifying the purchase of the console in the first place. Its scale is massive, showing off the difference in scope and time investment between digital adventures and traditional passive media. Its production is top-notch, with voice acting, lip-syncing, and character animations that genuinely are equivalent to live-action storytelling. It is, in ways, an ambassador for the medium, presenting the things video games do uniquely alongside glossy, high-budget examples of mixed media storytelling that stretch between different mediums and create familiar resonance. If you have never played a video game before, Forbidden West is a spectacular and robust example of what the whole fuss is even about. If you've played a lot of video games, then the things that are familiar retreads of genre and mechanics are still presented in a way that's undeniably smooth and competent. Everything works perfectly, immediately, responsively. It is a game almost completely without jank, which is hard to do. It is robustly designed as a flagship AAA experience where it is nearly impossible not to have fun unless you just aren't a fan of open-world titles in general, in which case you probably wouldn't buy it anyway. The risk with Forbidden West, actually, is too much fun. The map is so fucking huge, the main story is so surprisingly long, that it is likelier that a player will burn out than it is for them not to be engaged in the first place. I loved Zero Dawn, but one of my favorite things about it was its compactness, its fast pace, and manageable map size. Forbidden West forgoes those virtues in favor of a maximalist extreme. It isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think it does represent the upper range of what a game can be before becoming utterly excessive and overwhelming. But that's part of its mainstream appeal. When you know what your audience wants, a crowd pleaser is obligated to give it to them, leaving no gaps for competitors to fulfill that audience craving instead, until audiences are so overstuffed with the experience that they keel over or burst. That difference in scale between Forbidden West and Zero Dawn is most evident in the way their maps and stories expand. In Zero Dawn, the introduction sequence took less than an hour. There was a tutorial valley, then the map opened up pretty much completely, though some new regions were gated by the story. In Forbidden West, the introduction is a 3-part affair that takes many hours. There's the initial tutorial quest, then there's the tutorial valley, then a massive antechamber region, then the bulk of the world map, followed by a final story-gated region. And then the DLC region, of course. Where the first game took me around 60 hours to do a somewhat completionist playthrough, the same approach with the sequel took me a whopping 110. It has more to set up and execute on with its narrative, and a commitment to transforming the open-world format of the last game into something grander. Where the last game took place in condensed versions of Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming for the DLC, this one encompasses pretty much the whole American Southwest and beyond, with Utah, New Mexico, Nevada, Central California, and then Southern California for its DLC. The regions aren't so large or detailed as to feel like real reproductions, but they all manage to capture the core vibe of each state through clever use of landscapes and landmarks. They are large enough to make Aloy's journey feel like a real odyssey, something that would take weeks and not hours. That's the approach to scale that permeates so many of the design choices: strategic, colorful maximalism, coupled with attention to key details to sell the broader ideas. The situation is immediately dire. Despite Aloy's victory over the Hades kill switch in the first game, the world is dying anyway, with no unified AI running the systems. Broken protocols refusing to interact and cooperate with one another has led to plagues, storms, and within weeks there will be complete environmental collapse. Aloy's only hope is to rebuild and restore Gaia, the operating system that her progenitor, Elizabeth Sobek, pioneered. As the game opens, she is pursuing her final lead, the space launch facility where the Far Zenith project attempted to leave the dying Earth in the days before the old civilization fell. The Far Zenith project was prefaced in the last game, and it begins with the understanding that the starship was destroyed en route and nothing remains. I didn't replay Zero Dawn in anticipation of Forbidden West, I just dived on in, and the tutorialization was welcome in catching me back up to speed. Aloy and Varl are traveling together, and Varl's ignorance to some major plot events of the first game allow Aloy to go over them again and catch a player up at the same time. The quest is massive, sprawling, and slow. It took me well over an hour, and this is just the barest half of a percentage point of the overall content in the game. After establishing the plot, the mood, and the rhythm of play, it chucks the player into a high-stakes boss fight far more intense than anything in Zero Dawn's opening hours. It's strange, though. Mechanically, for a game the size of Forbidden West, it is impossible to start a player out at the same power level they ended the last game at. There would be simply no way to meaningfully progress without completely blowing out the power curve and ruining the intended rhythm of play. This is the same reason why, if you go into New Game Plus, the game suggests that you use the ultra-hard difficulty. The entire mechanical balance has to wildly shift to accommodate an Aloy who begins the game at full strength. And yet, the events of the last game have to matter narratively, or else there would be nothing to build on. Forbidden West splits the difference by dialing back the player's power a significant amount overall, making them more vulnerable, while at the same time making the enemies stronger and more clever, immediately thrusting the player into situations of greater intensity. This half measure isn't the smoothest thing in the world, but it is actually a surprisingly effective compromise between linear progress from one title to another and a full reboot, reset kind of experience. When Gaia cannot be found at the Far Zenith facility, Aloy returns to Meridian for a narrative interlude that is completely linear with the last game, acting as a kind of epilogue for Zero Dawn as much as it is an introduction for Forbidden West. Familiar faces return, there is a chance to say goodbye to the city you saved, there is exposition and intrigue where the voiceover by Silence at the end of the last game is reconfigured into a direct message to Aloy so that she can begin her new adventure and leave this more familiar world behind. One of the real strengths of a high-budget adventure like this is character animation and their stage presence. In the games I grew up with, actual character models were more like marionettes, puppets whose charisma came primarily from the voice work behind them. In a lush, modern production like this, they are actually more straightforwardly digital actors, the fact that they're animated not proving to be much of a barrier to how human they come across as. Aloy's interactions with Avad the Sun King are particularly illustrative in this regard. He likes her, and the feeling is lopsided, attention conveyed much more through body language and voice tone than explicit dialogue. This used to be something that movies and TV shows and stage plays had over on video games, that non-verbal storytelling. No longer. I mean, it costs an ungodly amount of money and developmental resources to achieve that parody. This is a decades-in-the-making kind of shift for the medium. Even within that shift, Forbidden West is itself an incremental improvement and not a dramatic one. Things have been going in this direction for years across many titles from many developers. But still, as someone who's been playing games their whole life and has seen the shift take place over the long years, it is fucking crazy to see the promise come to such charismatic fruition in a title like this. I'm fond of independent games, and often that's where the most creativity in the medium can be found, but the AAA sphere is still where the wildest technical achievements are most often most apparent. There is a cost to looking this good, and that cost can't be paid without designing for such a broad range of players that they stand a chance of making that money back again when all is said and done. The tutorial Valley of Zion well illustrates the ways Forbidden West both meets and transcends those mainstream expectations. Where the opening quest tutorial was about how to play and what the mechanical verbiage of the game is, this broader tutorial is systemic, presenting the overlapping, interconnected gameplay loops and showing how they fit together in a limited open world before it dumps you in the deep end of something that might be too overwhelming. Knowing how to hunt, it now teaches why to hunt, presents the resources needed for crafting ammunition and upgrades, makes tangible the difference in player power between using those upgrades and going without, illustrates the balance of elemental weaknesses and structural weaknesses that make destroying these machines with bows and arrows possible. Big-budget sequels like this have to grow their audience far beyond the reach of the previous title, necessarily meaning that a large proportion of players will really need this kind of staggered, structured introduction. This is the expectation being met. The expectations being exceeded have to do with the world building. It is not necessary to make the introductory town of Chainscrape so pleasantly vivid or to portray the edge of Karja-controlled territory so complexly, setting up meaningful contrast with the tribes yet to come. Within the town of Chainscrape, you have a wide variety of characters with distinct personalities and motives. A local populist who takes advantage of the workers while pretending to advance their interests, for example, contrasted with a Karja official who is seen as being an out-of-touch political appointee from a faraway land, despite him doing more to support the town's success. Aloy meets old friends, she makes new ones, she meets people who are kind, people who are cruel, people who are lost and suffering, and those who would prey upon those people. It is truly impressive how well the side quest vignettes paint a collective image of what life is like on the farthest frontier of an empire. There's follow-up with specific characters like Erend confronting Aloy about her leaving after the last game's climax without explaining to anyone why. There's follow-up with previous organizations, epilogue content that isn't fully connected to the plot to come but helps flesh out what came before. There are refugees who lost their place in the world and the structure of their religious beliefs when Aloy collapsed their society, who she can now help in a small but meaningful way, allowing them to find a home in Chainscrape and fend off the small-town bullies who would rob them. And there are the Zealots, militaristic true believers who are planning to assault the fortress of Barrenlight and break through to the lands behind where they can rebuild the power you took away. Of course, the solution to that problem is stabbing them before they can pull it off, which functions as a kind of secondary stealth combat tutorial versus human opponents instead of machine opponents. Hell, you can even experience such minor tangential thrills as helping a cook restore his self-confidence while scoring a tasty stat-boosting dish in the process. Any mainstream AAA title would use this opportunity to reintroduce its world and its mechanics in a similar way. Forbidden West is special in how complexly and thoroughly it uses its side quests and side characters to create emotional connections for both Aloy and the player to latch onto, establish parallels with the previous game and nostalgia for it, and to do serious world building primarily through character instead of exposition. It is a AAA game that is just as focused on effective theater as it is on satisfying gameplay loops. It's a world that's absurd, metal animals and dinosaurs, feudal and tribal societies with outlandish costuming, science fiction all muddled together with a young adult fantasy adventure. It works, though, not because these elements are original and not because they are harmonious, but because through its vivid characterization and emotional stakes, it filters all these absurdities through a humanistic lens that makes it all feel casually plausible. Once the Zion section is complete, the various tribes of the Tenakth are introduced. 3 regional tribes who are narratively interactive, and then a hostile 4th splinter tribe who exists to litter the map with strongholds to conquer and provide mechanical interactivity. Before the 3 main capitals of the Tenakth open up, the early game is corralled within the large but more limited lands of the Utaru. I found this sort of perplexing at first. Do we really need a 3rd introductory section? In many ways, the game doesn't. There is nothing really to be tutorialized that hasn't already. Mechanically, the experience is not significantly different within this portion of the map compared to later ones, with the exception of some of the meaner machines being locked in the areas further west. The reason for the separation of this area from the others seems mainly to be related to pacing and narrative. There is much that has to be tied up in terms of threads from the last game, and much to be established to really open up the main quest lines of Forbidden West. Even culturally, there's a bit of thematic staggering being done. The Tenakth are warrior cultures. All 3 tribes are based around martial prowess and fierce territorialism as central values. As such, a player is best incorporated into them when their own martial prowess has had time to develop, when they are far enough along the mechanical curve to feel fierce within the gameplay. To earn the Tenakth's respect, coming straight out of the tutorial valley with basic gear and basic abilities would create a bit of a disconnect, too much flattery for not enough lethality. The Utaru, on the other hand, are agrarians. They have always lived in abundance. They are not especially skilled warriors. In fact, they have a kind of exchange with the Tenakth where they trade the food and resources that are typically in such surplus for skilled warriors who come in to train them in the arts of war they would otherwise never invest in. The cool complication is that the surplus that the Utaru usually have has been completely obliterated. The system failures that threaten the stability of the world's artificially maintained ecosystem have hit them first and hit them hardest. The land gods they worship, the machines that have grown their crops for generations, are broken and malfunctioning. Red blight covers the fields around their city. The Council of Elders, who, in times of plenty, have been seen as kind and wise, are completely failing to meet the moment and recognize the danger of it, instead descending into a kind of spiritual apathy where they feel that if the land wants to die, then they are bound to die along with it, and there's not much to be done. Which, of course, makes a wonderful foil for Aloy's impatient pragmatism. She is completely unimpressed with the Utaru's spiritual approach. There are even side quests where she solves a murder among the Utaru, eventually discovering that one of the council elders is responsible for the killing, silencing the voice of a younger Utaru who called for more bold and decisive action to save their people. Aloy's words for the murderer are incredibly harsh. The last thing the elder hears is the poison she took rather than face consequences courses through her veins. Aloy's character in this game is often a little darker than she was in the previous one, and I like that quite a bit. She has seen some shit. She has experienced betrayal. She knows the stakes of all that is happening in the world and how apathy in the face of everything means the death of the world entire. She has shouldered this burden willingly, but it weighs heavy. As such, she has no respect for anyone who would rather turn away than help carry the burden themselves. A wonderful scene that kind of expresses this newfound hardness is her confrontation with Hades. Hades was the last game's big bad, the Gaia subsystem tasked with cleansing the Earth and starting over if things went bad for some reason. It escapes to be captured by Silence in the epilogue teaser of Zero Dawn. But rather than run Hades as a villain again, Silence takes care of pretty much the whole thing for you. He traps Hades on a local server and then tortures it, breaking it down so it gives up its darkest secrets. When Aloy finally encounters Hades, it's only because Silence wants her to, only because he is completely done with it and has discarded it like trash. As Aloy banters with Hades, it is reduced to nothing more than a flicker of digital consciousness, a hateful ember long after the fire has burned out. She is not above savoring this. She is more powerful, more cunning. She has triumphed, and Hades knows it and despises her for it with everything it has left. I love the peculiar blend of sci-fi and fantasy within the Horizon series. This is an audience with a god, one who is defined in earthly technological terms so as to be artificial instead of supernatural, but the texture and dialogue of the scene is indistinguishable from what a fantasy context would be, a mortal meeting the divine villain and finding an opportunity to gloat. And she's earned that reversal of fortunes. It took her, and you by extension, a whole fucking game to do it. The way the narrative builds off the first game as a sequel that way is deeply satisfying, and having this conversation relatively early in the grand scheme of the game also sets up a key pivot in thematic perspective. In the first game, machines were the major villains, with humans of the old world like Ted Faro serving more as distant background characters. Forbidden West's narrative escalation is clever. Rather than introduce some even more evil machine intelligence, it pivots backwards to place the blame where the blame has always really belonged, on the greed of the ultra-rich who assumed that all the beauty of the world was expendable and that only they mattered in the end. One of the best ways to establish reader or player interest when world building is to establish rules with the intention of breaking them later on, creating exceptions where the exceptions cause the plot complications. This works for either protagonists or villains. Zero Dawn established so many rules and expectations within the setting that Forbidden West is in a fine position to bend or break many of them. Even if you hadn't played the first game, this is where the game's opening mission comes back into play. The Far Zenith project was known to have failed, all those rich assholes vaporized in space, as they may have deserved. No one was coming back to save them, so in the first game it was to Aloy and the gang to save themselves. In Forbidden West's first genuine plot twist, Aloy reaches the copy of Gaia she's been seeking just moments before a surprise competitor does. The Zeniths returned at last. Naturally, they don't seek to improve the world. They wish to reset it, to tear it all down so that they can build back something that they can control. Despite using high technology to extend their lives, they have learned nothing from Earth's first apocalypse. If anything, 1,000 years of isolation and navel-gazing has made them infinitely worse. Again, we have a science fiction explanation for something that is narratively closer to fantasy. The Zeniths are like gods themselves, returning vengefully from the heavens to take and to punish. Hades, after all, was built to clean up the mess these people made. Having them return and be even more on their bullshit than ever before is a wonderfully ironic kind of escalation for the series to make. The Zeniths aren't a major presence outside of key moments in the main storyline, but they make quite an impact when they are around. Their introduction is especially fantastic because of how exciting and dire it is. They come so close to killing Aloy and come across as effectively invincible. They're using a different clone of Elizabeth Sobek to access the same systems that Aloy can. Their pet version is called Beta. As the plot goes on, Beta defects to Aloy's side and becomes a kind of accidental sister to her. The game makes much of their contrasting personalities. There are parts of them that are similar by nature, like their curiosity and intelligence, and parts that are wildly divergent based on nurture and experience, like Beta's pessimism versus Aloy's determined optimism. The really fascinating twist here comes from Beta's connection to the villains. She was treated as more than just a tool by Tilda Vandermeer, who once knew Sobek back in the day and maintained a kind of nostalgic fondness for her through the years. Tilda's possessiveness takes a long time to become clear. Like she had saved Beta from the other Zeniths, she saves Aloy at a critical moment, defecting so that she can become the one and only survivor of Old Earth. She gives Aloy the same treatment she gave Beta. She takes her home. Aloy awakens in the basement of Tilda's old mansion, where Tilda spends a huge amount of time talking to her about art. Like around 15 to 20 minutes of actual game time. This is completely skippable, but as a character moment for both of them, I think it's fascinating. Aloy is a very literal person. She does not have an appreciation for these things. Tilda, for her part, is showing off. This is her collection, her passion. This is the way she demonstrates to Aloy that not only is she vastly older, she is vastly wiser and more cultured as well. The key thing to home in on is that she did this same thing with Beta. So what is she trying to prove? Later, it comes out that Tilda and Sobek were lovers back in the day. It's even foreshadowed in an extremely early holographic memory that Aloy comes across. Tilda is not just proving her superiority, she is deliberately trying to reverse a dynamic that she had with Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the better woman. She was the one who was actually wiser, the one who had the courage to stay and fix things even when it meant her death. Tilda is undeniably smart and certainly a sophisticate, but Elizabeth was a true genius, and there was an undercurrent of jealousy in that regard. Now, 1,000 years later, she has the clones of Elizabeth to toy with and manipulate. She can rewrite her personal history to be the one in control of the relationship. This isn't just a subtext either. This is the character logic that sets up the game's final boss fight, where Tilda demands that Aloy leave the Earth with her, whether Aloy wants to or not. To Tilda, Aloy is not a person. No one really is except herself. She has become a perfectly selfish and solipsistic creature. It is, oddly, not entirely uncommon within sci-fi to resolve a toxic lesbian fixation through fights with giant robots, so one can sort of argue the game's finale is rooted in tradition there. But what's uncommon is how robust the character work is surrounding all of this. There is so much detail, so many hints toward Tilda's betrayal and her motivations, so many wonderful layers of character for everyone involved, Aloy, Beta, and Tilda. Tilda has a scene of exposition that lasts 20 full minutes there in her old mansion, where she invites Aloy for a kind of dinner meeting. The aesthetics of it are just immaculate. If one was going to meet a goddess, some living artifact of the world before, then surely it would look something exactly like this. Layers of time, the mansion crumbling and decrepit, but the table settings perfect and hypermodern. Layers of motivation as Tilda tries to manipulate Aloy in ways that she could never successfully manipulate Sobek, even as the stubbornness and compassion that both Aloy and Sobek have at the core of their personalities confounds Tilda like it always has. Layers of plot, schemes against schemes as the two argue over what counts as an acceptable sacrifice in matters of war. It is dense, intricate, and at the same time hugely sprawling. 20 minutes is fully 1/3 of an episode of prestige television, and the scene is presented without cutting to anything else, just pure dialogue and vibes. For Forbidden West, this is what AAA storytelling means, taking the time to present something novelistically dense with the technology to make it eye-poppingly vibrant. Visually, it is intoxicatingly gorgeous, and yet Aloy is clever enough not to be taken in by it, knowing full well that a woman who saved herself at the expense of the whole world once is likely to do the same thing twice if ever given the opportunity. In Zero Dawn, this particular kind of oligarchical narcissism was mainly represented by Ted Faro, the man who killed the world. His genocidal robots are draped dead and rusting over every hill and across every valley of this game's map, dormant still because of your victory in the previous title. The Zeniths as villains are partly meant to show that Faro was not some sort of aberration. It was a worldwide culture of corporate greed that set the stage for complete annihilation. But Faro is still the worst of them, and Forbidden West pushes how terrible he was into bold new territory. The quest with Ted Faro's tomb, his private bunker under San Francisco, is by far the best quest in the game, and the one most beautifully representative of Horizon's synthesis between science fiction and mythology. Aloy needs to get into the tomb because Faro hid things within Gaia, locked behind a special layer of encrypted access that only he could use. To get the clearance, his corpse must be found. But times have changed for San Francisco in the past millennium. It is now an island of spires, crumbling skyscrapers stranded amid the waves along the California coast. A culture of xenophobic, feudalistic technology hoarders called the Quen has made the place their temporary home. Leading them is their dear, beloved Sio, a deluded king who thinks he is the reincarnation of old Ted Faro himself. Since Aloy is clearly a reincarnation of Sobek, he accepts her help. Sio is a wonderful villain simply because he is so utterly annoying. I mean, can you imagine being subject to the whims of a mad, megalomaniacal idiot who nevertheless remains dangerous as those around him in power acquiesce to his nonsensical and costly decisions because they're just too cowardly to refuse or refute his delusions? Shit sucks, yo. I'm so fucking tired of it. While Sio is a satire of this attitude, not any particular person, it's wild how well the character's cliches map onto the real world. Especially that feeling of sinister dread lurking behind the vapid smile he has. This is a man who can and does have people killed all the time, who sees himself as more important than any one life. He is impossible to take seriously, but failing to take him seriously is a recipe for even greater disaster. Although he is not a clone of Ted Faro actually the way Aloy is a clone, he is every bit the same unblinkingly, cravenly selfish person made manifest one more time. Ted Faro's tomb is deliberately designed with Egyptian motifs, making the pun of his name more obvious than ever. Look at this statue he put up. Reading the logs, a real little horror story emerges. There are only a handful of people down here in his bunker, some doctors, some sycophants, some floozies. And even for such a limited audience, he felt he needed this great golden statue. Like with the Tilda conversation, there's a sense of time being layered, and in this case, of history rhyming. Reading the logs, you learn of how Faro toyed with his supplicants, trapped down here for the rest of their lives. While at the same time, you wear a ridiculous costume that Sio forced you to put on, pressured to clear the way by armed guards who act as extensions of Sio's capricious will. Faro's fatal games kept culling the population smaller and smaller until only one doctor was left, one who had nothing left but revenge. He convinced Faro that the way for him to truly become immortal was to venture into the power core and coil himself around all that exotic energy. What happened to him then is implied but not specifically shown. I'm a huge body horror fan and would have adored some wild, monstrous gore, but it doesn't really fit the tone or aesthetics of the broader game. I think, although I wanted more, that this was probably the judicious creative choice. The implication is powerful and memorable enough. Faro's last message was that he couldn't wait to meet his children and to shape them in his image. If he was able to perceive CO, he would find that this had happened naturally enough without him. It's a truly delicious irony. An Egyptian-style tomb with a sci-fi mummy's curse buried under the Transamerica Pyramid. Fucking amazing. CO naturally blames you as the place crumbles. On his way out, he gets plenty of people killed, and in pushing one of them out of his way, he falls to his own death. Pharaoh's statue then falls apart and crushes him. I would rate this as one of video gaming's all-time most satisfying villain deaths. Just absolutely, positively, fuck that guy. The Quen don't miss him. He's replaced by a know-nothing toady, but this is generally regarded as an improvement overall. Aloy has what she needs, and the new Ted Pharaoh is crushed under the ego of the old Ted Pharaoh. While the meat of Forbidden West storytelling is done cumulatively between both games and over the long term, its extremely large and sprawling main quests function as opportunities for some remarkable episodic storytelling as well. The best ones always seem to leverage these gaps between past and present culture to great dramatic effect. First, though, you've got to actually advance the plot enough to get out of the Utaru lands, which means closing out the first game's villain with Hades, establishing the new threat of the Zeniths, upending Utaru society by discovering that Hephaestus, the AI threat from the Frozen Wilds expansion of the first game, is behind the corruption of their land gods, and then, finally, establishing a permanent home base at a Gaia seed storage facility. This is like 20 to 30 hours of work, all to finally resolve what can be collectively understood as the introductory chapters. The world map that opens to you then is 4 times the size of what you've already experienced, even if you've investigated it thoroughly. It is impossible to understate how fucking big this world is. To fix Gaia and foil the Zenith's plans, you must bring Hephaestus back into the fold, but you don't have enough processing power, so 3 other Gaia modules have to be found and added to the whole first. These 3 quests correspond to the 3 major Tanakh tribal territories, their 3 major capital cities. The Isle of Spires features the Quen and their temporary city of Landfall as the 4th tribe and capital. And across all that wide-open country are dozens upon dozens of optional puzzles ranging from survey drones that have to be jumped on and brought down, to complex ruins that take 15 to 30 minutes to complete, 2 difficulty tiers of enemy strongholds, hunting grounds both formal and informal, and absolutely preposterous amounts of hidden resources in both boxes and in the form of a resource called a green shine. I find it hard to imagine sticking to just the critical path. Not only are there diversions everywhere, they are typically highlighted within the landscape in a scenic way that makes them evocative and intriguing. They draw curiosity incredibly well. The many different biomes of the world map provide aesthetic flavor contrasts even between familiar tasks. Some of these tasks have more meaning than others. Survey drones are probably the most completely peripheral. Each of them involves a climbing puzzle of some sort to find a ledge off of which you can jump, grab a hold of the floating drone, and pull it down to Earth so you can snatch its hard drive. Nothing is revealed. Their only practical use is to unlock different backdrops for the domed room where you talk to Gaia. You talk to Gaia a lot. She reveals through optional side conversations an absolutely preposterous amount of exposition about main quests, major characters, gaps in the world building, and lore about the old world that's buried under the grass. But once these conversations begin, the dome goes to a neutral black color. This seems to be so that the brightness of the landscapes don't wash out Gaia's translucent colors. She looks most impressive with a dark backdrop. So then, the survey drones decorate a small room that you only visit for one purpose and then do not display when you're actually using the room for that intended purpose. It is an utterly useless task to accomplish, besides the immediate present tense excitement of having a little jumping puzzle to solve. It is the very definition of a vapid open-world task, something to populate the vastness of the landscape with interactivity with no thematic goal. But consider instead the black boxes. These are also small, short puzzles that serve very little purpose, but they have a light narrative element that elevates them higher, makes them part of the fiction and the game, and not just one or the other. They all play short audio records of how the shattered planes you find them in went down. They help fill in the picture of the hopeless final days when the machines were nearing the end of their campaign to eliminate all life. Daring bravery, sudden shock, solemn resignation, the black boxes cycle through a wide range of emotional responses to inevitable death. Then you also get prizes. You can turn them in for rare machine parts that can help fill out item upgrade requirements. Once you've found them all, you get a more powerful blast sling than you can find or buy anywhere outside of the DLC. It's a lot of effort, but it has enough little treats along the way and a valuable enough prize at the end to feel more worth the time investment than the survey drones did. One of my favorite tasks actually largely fails to offer any kind of meaningful reward mechanically, but I find them incredibly evocative and so seek them out anyway. The Vista Points are fiddly, annoying puzzles where you have to line up an old holopicture with the place that picture was taken. The mental work involved is kind of fun and meaningfully different from a lot of the other puzzles in the game. It makes you think about the landscape in a cool way, but close enough isn't good enough, and finding the exact spot once you've divined the general spot is genuinely annoying as hell a lot of the time. When the Vista spot lines up, however, and the color comes back into the picture, the old world wistfully superimposed over the new, the effect is so dramatic that I'm just inclined to forgive the fiddly part. Horizon Forbidden West feels much more fantastic than familiar much of the time, so these grounding moments really help sell the fundamental melancholy that a lot of the tone operates on. The new world is so beautiful in so many ways, but look at what wonders were needlessly lost, architectural marvels and scientific wonders, the likes of which may never be seen again. Because that's the thing that makes the villains villainous. They did not treasure the world they had. They were careless, selfish people who destroyed the lives and legacies of every other human in the world. Having that melancholic resonance between past and present is the absolute heart of what makes Horizon's world building feel unique. That mismatch between time investment and a sense of being adequately compensated for it does come up a lot, though. Like with the capital R ruins. These are too long and too complicated to really be categorized as a collectible, but in a lot of ways, they kind of are. They're intricate, often maze-like puzzles with many steps to open up the doors to the prize. The prize, however, is always a new holiday theme for the hologram projectors in old Las Vegas. You get a lot of them by the end, but if it's not that particular holiday, and in most cases, even if you were playing on some specific holiday, it's just a largely pointless flourish that doesn't seem to fill any narrative or mechanical purpose. The puzzles themselves, though, are quite good. They are all considerably harder than any puzzles presented along the main path, a kind of necessary escalation to get the most out of the climbing navigation mechanics. Every single one of them had me feeling stumped at one point or another. None of them were smooth sailing for me. But they all became clear, eventually, by just examining the environment closely and thinking of how all the limited interactive elements can combine with each other. Which is to say that finding the sweet spot between obvious and obtuse is hard to hit for any game, especially in a game like this, which is not primarily a puzzler. I played all 3 Watch Dogs games, for example, and never had to put this much effort into solving a puzzle once. The ruins themselves are often kind of visually intriguing or notable locations, with the exception of the time it's just a concrete railway tunnel. There's sometimes interesting plot or background stuff going on, but not often. For example, the first ruin is the lodge at Zion National Park. It also features in one of the game's Vista Points. It's hardly the most evocative among them, but it does establish the scale of your journey with the knowledge that you've got to make it all the way from here in Utah to the California coast. If the ultimate reward is kind of a pointless flop, and the narrative rewards are slight, then the mechanical aspect had better be really fucking good to compensate. In the case of the ruins, it is. For most of the game, very scattered ruins is pretty much all you get. The game wants to present natural landscapes for as long as possible to make the skyscraper island of San Francisco that much more climactic and distinct by the time you get to it. But I feel like this was a bit of a mistake. Zero Dawn introduced a shattered urban skyline relatively early on, and they played a big role in creating a more unique character for the landscape. Without these skyscrapers, with the ruins smaller and more scattered, there is less to immediately distinguish things from other lush outdoor open worlds. Las Vegas is the big exception here. Instead of looming husks of skyscrapers, there are the weird and windswept ruins of the casino strip, skeletal above ground and drowned under deep waters below ground. It's one of my favorite quest lines in the game, pulling on every aspect of design that makes the game so enjoyable. First, the framing. A city of lost riches, covered in water, below the desert. It's a compelling prize and a compelling puzzle from the very outset. Second, the character work. The location has been scouted by a band of Oseram performers, one of whom is mechanically clever and a big dreamer, one of whom is practical and cynical as the money counter of the group, and an old-timer who can't break the habit of narrating everything like a story. As a small ensemble, they are well-balanced, each of them casually believable and distinct from one another. Even the prose speaker knows how to turn it off and not be too annoying with it. He comes across as wry and playful rather than jokey and irritating. Third, the exploration of the ruins themselves introduces an entirely new way of navigating. You have to build a rebreather to get down there. Until you do this questline, most of the water areas and treasures in the broader open world are off-limits. So it serves as a tutorial, dozens of hours deep into the game, for a mechanic that'll open up maybe a half dozen more hours of side content to explore, which is kind of tantalizing. The ruins of San Francisco particularly take advantage of underwater exploration, with a whole collection quest through a drowned neighborhood and a vista point of a now aquatic Golden Gate Park. There is so much thought put into not only creating scenic vistas, but probing the limits of what kind of scenery it can portray. Waterworld, with Kevin Costner, largely deserves its reputation as a weird flop, but it has some wonderful moments and tremendous set design, and its most visually impactful comes when Costner, who has gills as a kind of low-key mutant, shows the supporting protagonist a city under the waves, drawing the sand into his hands and showing her, for the first time in her life, that the world has a bottom to it. What Waterworld tried to do thematically but couldn't quite manage, Forbidden West accomplishes easily. Draining out the water from Las Vegas to allow the climactic boss fight to occur is the extent of the main quest, but doing so opens up several complicated little optional areas where a player can explore what they've just uncovered as part of new quests in pursuit of new rewards. The mandatory component, at a low baseline of difficulty, branches out into smaller limbs of higher difficulty optional content. There is a series of audio logs from the man who rebuilt the modern underground Vegas experience. He went on to become one of the Far Zeniths, though he does not survive to feature as an antagonist. He wasn't the worst person. He built his fortunes, he made his choices. He lived to see the world end and the Vegas lights go out. While he's sad to see his own dream die, it's just a drop in the bucket of the end of the world. But Vegas is a dream that's hard to kill. Once you retrieve the Poseidon core that's responsible for the water levels, the old lights of Vegas all come back on. The Oseram on the surface were looking for artifacts to take back home, but as soon as they see the lights, they realize that this is an artifact where the folks at home will come to them. Their future isn't in delving, it's in hospitality. And that's the fun flip side of the setting's melancholy tone. It wasn't the end of all worlds, just the one we knew. And what was left still creates powerful echoes, sometimes creating a sad resonance, sometimes creating a satirical irony. The accidental immortality of the Vegas dream is deeply funny. The Oseram performers coming into their own kind of jackpot there is a bright, optimistic surprise outcome from the whole deal. Aloy's austere personality prevents her from coming across as a deliberate do-gooder sort. She sees herself as more of a problem solver instead, so the fact that so much good does blossom in her wake feels more earned and unexpected than if she had set out to try and achieve these ends regularly. Visually, emotionally, navigationally, mechanically, nothing about the quest is wholly novel, but everything about it is presented with a high amount of effort and gloss, each element of design in harmony. There's hours of content just in this one section. If you cut the open world stuff out entirely and just stacked the linear main quests end to end, this would still be a 30-hour game. The question to ask about Forbidden West is how much is really improved when it quadruples that length and quintuples in size. Finding one of the other Gaia modules, Demeter, unlocks the ability to open up the metal flowers that dot the landscape, disintegrating their foliage and revealing hidden paths and resources. It felt like a big mystery to me at first, wondering what unique things might be stashed away behind the ability gates. Well, the wondering was more fun. In actuality, they're just plain chests with the regular kinds of rewards behind them. Since you can fast travel back to them, and because I had done most of the world map by the time I got to Demeter, it took me like an hour to cruise through all the points of interest I had already discovered. It made me temporarily wealthy, and shockingly little else. It makes me wonder, is nothing better than something when it comes to these kinds of realistic scenic landscapes? Is making sure there's a point of interest every 60 seconds really more important than just letting open country be open country? Mechanically, probably so. It has to do with attention span and assumptions about interactivity. Open country that's just scenic for the sake of it is, of course, interactively inert. Even when you go to a national park, your two options are typically to walk to things and to look at things, which is worth it, an important human experience, but not what people typically turn to a game for. Zero Dawn's tighter map had better pacing and often better collectibles and tasks. Forbidden West has so much space it doesn't know what to do with it all, to the point where chests, but for later I guess, ended up being something close to a third of the total map icons. Some activities from Zero Dawn, however, get the opposite treatment. Tall necks and cauldrons are less frequent but far more complicated. Tall necks reveal the map and all its many icons, but this time it's not simply a jumping puzzle. There is always a major complication, like here in the California forest where you have to navigate through a shattered treehouse settlement to find a perch high enough to jump. It's a much wider range of traversal challenges than just finding the high ground. The tall neck in the desert needs to be brought down to its knees with ropes for repairs, incorporating a combat challenge as the noise draws a crowd. This one in San Francisco requires an underwater scavenger hunt to reactivate it, then the traditional jumping puzzle. Each tall neck is distinct in its challenge, its landscape, never once does it feel like a repetitive task. The cauldrons are challenge dungeons that take place in the ultra-high-tech foundries where the machines that populate the surface of the Earth are made. The reward is overrides for some of the machines, allowing you to temporarily turn them to your side, even the big dinosaur fuckers. But the point of the cauldrons is more, I feel, to vary the play experience. This is an opportunity to solve the static landscape issue and make all the traversal elements interactive. Moving around the big machines that make up the cauldron interiors creates platforming challenges that natural landscape would never allow, especially in terms of moving pieces. In a game that tries to be many things to many people, the diversity of both mechanics and aesthetics goes a long way towards making that happen. Both science fiction and fantasy adventure, both a platformer and a tactical combat title, cinematic storytelling, alongside player-directed pacing. All it's trying to do is everything, and the wild thing about Forbidden West is how well it actually succeeds. So, yes, some parts are slight, and some fall flat, but the average of the experience skews toward excellent. All the cauldrons are similarly distinct, like the tall necks. One is inundated with lava, another filled with ocean water. One of them actually hides a tall neck of its own, which has to be reassembled in a long sequence. Each cauldron is around an hour of play. End to end, they total nearly the length of an average Resident Evil game. Forbidden West's sense of epic adventure hinges on those long, cumulative hours, but the main hook is measured in moments instead. Forbidden West's combat feels tighter and a little more dangerous than it did in Zero Dawn. There's a much wider array of robots to hunt, everything from Zero Dawn and its Frozen Wilds expansion, and then a menagerie of new robots ranging from basic lower-level enemies to towering colossi of metal. By making the combat just a bit more dangerous, it guides players to make more tactical choices, to pay attention to the elemental damage mechanics, and to switch up the weapons they use. Though, for me, I just love the bows so fucking much. The rhythm of them is fantastic, the camera zooming slightly with the pullback, the smoothness of snapping into the slow-mo focused aiming mode, the bright snap of releasing the arrow, the enemy reacting in shock to the impact when it hits a vital spot. The reactivity of all these elements creates such a deeply satisfying combat experience. The player makes tactical choices of how to engage, which can be very satisfying when you get the drop on something and really fuck it up before it has a chance to even get mad about it. Traps, long-range engagement, using bombs, just like how basic navigation is often made into a puzzle, all combat scenarios are little puzzles unto themselves as well. Hunting ground challenges and rounds of arena combat make the puzzles explicit, creating a balance of enemies that require exploiting their weaknesses instead of a more generalized approach, or demanding the use of particular weapons in combat approaches. I kind of felt like the hunting grounds in Zero Dawn were a little better. The puzzles were more oriented around thinking about a situation, whereas in Forbidden West, there's a sense that it's more like an advanced tutorial of certain weapons and tactics. They're fighting pit challenges that actually are simply advanced tutorials. You progress through them by learning combos and then demonstrating your knowledge on an opponent weak to those particular moves. The tutorializing feels, to me, excessive. If I wanted to use a combo, I would rather it be up to me to learn it. Otherwise, I'm kind of content to just press the buttons my heart tells me to. The arena challenges largely avoid this trap. You go in with whatever inventory you please, except in some challenges that require specific kit, and your ammo expenditures don't count. Of course, you do have to pay for each attempt, so repeated failures can be costly. It's not a good idea to do these challenges until the mid-game at minimum, with many challenges intended for a late-game kind of damage output. But once a player feels ready, the arena challenges put a spotlight on how wonderfully tactical and choice-driven the combat can be. There are many valid answers to any combat puzzle, but the one constant is that a player must choose some kind of specific approach. Just going in with an intent to do damage is not enough. Are you exploiting resistances? Are you stripping away key components? Are you impairing the robot's mobility to make it less dangerous? Out in the world, in all the combat, one of the greatest joys of the combat loop is how reactive the enemies are to damage, the way they respond to different parts being stripped away or blown apart. They seem, for robots, so wonderfully alive. With all the weapons tuned to feel very tactile, the enemy is animated to feel animalistic, the special effects of sparks and fire and slowed time looking so gloriously high fidelity, the combat is undeniably mesmerizing. It's often as beautiful as the landscapes and far more interactive. This constant pivot between slower, scenic exploration and visceral, spectacular combat, with the in-between transition of tactically setting up an ambush of some sort, creates a rhythm that takes the 100-hour time investment and melts the hours away easily. The success is not just in presenting every kind of activity and every kind of storytelling and just hoping for the best, it's in creating an environment where these things are folding over on each other and blending in and out constantly and smoothly. By this method, a player never becomes bored. By this method, I blink and suddenly 4 hours have gone by. The game is arguably too large, but the basic gameplay loop is so compelling that I still consumed the whole damn thing eagerly and willingly. There is no one thing anyone can point to with Forbidden West and say, this is why it's popular. It is popular because of how smoothly it can be many things at once, and then many more things in rapid succession, an endless churn of words and actions and images that are all high effort, high quality, and highly curated. It's often hard to talk about games like this because they seem, in some ways, self-explanatory. They feel correct. They set up expectations of play, and then they meet those expectations very satisfactorily. You hunt the robots. It feels right. It feels good. It feels exactly like what one would expect if you said, this is the game where you hunt the robots. But creating that sense of seemingly effortless self-fulfillment is a crazy amount of work, the result of hundreds of small creative choices, aesthetic choices, programming choices. How much testing had to be done before the feel of the bow was just right? The timing of the pullback, the sound effects for release and impact, the snap of the interface icon when the string is at its most taut. These are worlds made up from nothing but math and sand. Everything about them that feels natural is the stagecraft of game design which traffics only in what is deliberate and unnatural. It is so easy to be entertained, but so fucking tricky and expensive to be entertaining. In titles like this, it becomes clear that sometimes entertainment is as much of a science as it is an art. In an article for the PlayStation blog in 2021, a lot of the developers at Guerrilla speak about the impact of all these little details. Living world designer Espen Song said, quote, "When you walk through the Forbidden West, everything should feel like it belongs there. The Living World team at Guerrilla works on aspects of the game that make the world feel authentic and alive, the tribes, the settlements, and the people within them. There's an intention behind everything we place within the world. Our main challenge is translating this narrative framework into visuals that are integral to the world itself. For example, the Tenakth are known to be competitive and combat-focused, but so are other tribes. So how do we distinguish them? How do we communicate that visually? It then becomes all about the details, and the animations, and the behaviors. Within their settlements, you'll see the Tenakth working out, readying themselves for battle. They're often younger because they need to be capable warriors. Their base is an ancient ruin from which they've picked up certain old-world gestures that they may not fully understand, like using a military salute to say hello. Ultimately, our goal is to make sure NPCs feel connected to where they live, and we work closely with other internal teams, such as narrative, quest, and environment, to make sure that every location feels authentic." End quote. I found this quote to be more accurate than a lot of the marketing hyperbole you get about these kinds of titles. Every town has a kind of flavor to it that makes sense, some kind of visible industry, some kind of a reason within the landscape for existing where it does. The tribes are distinct from one another with contrasting leadership and a lot of internal cultural variation. A water conflict among the desert tribes, for instance, leads to a showdown between two potential leaders where you have to choose which will live and which will die. Like with media such as The Hunger Games, it skews closer to young adult adventure than it does towards blood and grit, but it does this without abandoning its themes and the life or death stakes of its world and its conflicts. One leader is young, hungry, but impulsive. The other choice is austere, cruel, but a proven source of security for her people in an extremely hostile environment. I chose her because the water problem really began because the other guy just doesn't seem to understand how things work, except that he could probably do it better. I have seen that kind of arrogance before. I don't think it'll work out very well. An interesting aspect of tribalism in the Horizon games is that it's very explicitly post-racial. The reseeding of humanity has meant that every single community is already diverse in that way. It is not a source of difference or disagreement. Similarly, queer characters are generally seen as just a fact of life and not particularly notable as a cultural difference between peoples. There are even trans characters in minor roles just casually existing, which is more than many games are willing to do. So, without these surface-level, superficial drivers of antagonism and prejudice, cultures have to dig a little deeper to figure out why they hate each other. This leads to better world building overall. Conflict is driven by ideology, mythology, and religious disagreement, disparity of regional resources, stuff that feels nice and meaty within the fiction when it's explained with exposition and articulated within the drama of the side quests. Like, the Quen are knowledge seekers, but the upper castes of their society hoard the knowledge and prevent its use for fixing any kind of internal inequalities, leading to a very stratified social structure with a lot of tension. The Tenakth are held together by a kind of mythic federalism. Their chieftain, Hakaro, has united 3 disparate tribes under the same banner because of garbled, staticky messages and words from the museum where he holds his court. He doesn't really understand what the United States was, or that it had its own problems, but he's picked up on the vibe of these voices from the past and tried to model his present on it. He is a man of violence, but he's created a tenuous peace with all of these strange affectations that he's glimpsed fleetingly through the holograms. The very first Gaia core lies directly under his throne, actually, and once you've gotten his permission to take it, the holograms are restored. Everyone can see the visions only he had previously seen. The idea that Americanism is a dream that will last millennia is perhaps beginning to feel a little naive and dated, but the thing that's kind of ironic and clever about it is that the more simply the American dream is understood, the more appealing it is. Hakaro is driven by fragmented recollections of people at their best, of patriotic flame that burned so brightly because it was just about to be snuffed out forever. Even with the image intact, he will never know the whole picture. All he knows is the call for unity, the martial bravery of the United States' old soldiers, that enticing and dangerous pull towards becoming a nation and not just a tribe. The Vegas dream is presented as kind of an eternal recurrence because people will always desire an oasis, always be attracted to spectacle and vice. The American dream is presented as a recurrence because of how ultimately universal the impulse is to want to be part of something grander than oneself and one's circumstances. Within the fiction, America's role in failing to regulate Ted Faro before he accidentally killed every single life form on the planet is not part of Hakaro's thinking on the subject. Hakaro's thinking begins and ends at, wow, what possibilities. That's always when the American dream is at its most appealing, as a possibility, as a promise, as something to strive for. For Hakaro, I wish him better luck the second time. Regala, the rebel chieftain, has no time for the deeper past. She is much too fixated on retribution for the crimes of her contemporaries. She is brilliantly casted, played by screen legend Angela Bassett. Being digitized has not diminished Bassett's stage presence at all. She is every bit as compelling as she always is. And Regala makes such an interesting contrast to Aloy. Where Aloy is young, but worldly and pragmatic, Regala is extremely seasoned, less naive in many ways than Aloy, but much more emotionally driven at her core. During the reign of the Sun King, which you helped put an end to in the last game, the Karsha's red raids killed many Tenakth and shattered innumerable families within the tribes. Hakaro's willingness to make peace and put it behind him for the good of the Tenakth and its unified tribes makes her furious. She won't abide by it. She feels it goes against the Wario ethos you see demonstrated over and over across the many side quests and all three branches of the Tanakh. She feels Hikaru is changing too much culturally, giving up the right of vengeance that she uses herself to do her own kind of unification with her multi-tribal rebellion. Her characterization is excellent, but the main purpose of the rebels is actually mechanical. Human enemies have a completely different rhythm of engagement than the robots do. Their weapons are generally speaking more dangerous than the robot attacks, so stealth plays a greater role. The idea is very much to attack a camp by picking folks off one by one from stealth as much as possible, similar to how enemy encampments in Far Cry are meant to be approached. It's also the only mode of combat where melee makes much sense. Against the robots, it's imprecise, ineffective, and leaves you far more vulnerable to damage than any kind of ranged approach. Melee in those circumstances is mostly just about finishing the job, getting prompted critical hits on enemies that you stun by other means. Against human opponents, melee locks them down quite nicely and becomes the main way to engage with them, besides, of course, arrow headshots, which are wildly effective. It's kind of funny how little it matters if you actually use the fancy combos learned in the fighting pits. All that matters is largely that you hit the enemies. There were maybe a half-dozen occasions when the enemies did something that punished me in return for just gracelessly trying to lock them down with attacks. It's certainly possible to become overwhelmed by enemies in the camps. Once you disturb the hive by breaking stealth, there can be a dozen or more enemies suddenly zeroing in on you all at once. That pressure is there to encourage the stealth approach, making it unmanageable to just wing it without having given at least some thought to it in advance. One thing that's kind of crazy is that there's an entire aspect of Seilen's nefarious schemes that doesn't become understood at all unless you're keeping up with these rebel camps. There's a technology cult called the Sons of Prometheus who are working for him secretly, and it's them who are guiding Regala's Tanakh and giving them all the technical information they need to tame the robots like you do. They're digging up old Pharaoh war machines, the Corruptors, and then using the Corruptors' overrides to manipulate the newer machines. When I first saw the Sons of Prometheus, I kind of thought I must have accidentally done a narrative sequence break and discovered something that hadn't been talked about in the main plot yet. But it's different. They are barely discussed in the main plot at all until the very end, when the game can reasonably assume that you've seen them at least a couple of times already. The full background of the villain's plan in some way depends on a player's mechanical completionism this way, which is an odd gamble. It's odd to have such key story beats so far separated from the primary narrative and narrative delivery methods. But it also contributes to Forbidden West's impressive sense of environmental integration. Regala's whole rebellion can be mapped onto actual locations with discrete purposes. Here in the desert, where they dig up the Corruptors. There in the snowy mountains, where the Sons of Prometheus draw up her weapons. It's a villainous economy that actually has a chain of ideas and resources that can be traced in a linear way. Back over in the main plot, the way it makes Regala feel dangerous is by continually having her succeed, except for one last little dramatic hair's breadth, which Aloy provides by being in the right place at the right time. Regala is stronger than Hikaru, more vicious, more righteous in her anger. Even in the final battle, she is winning by a pretty comfortable margin until Aloy shows up on a flying mount with a janky energy bomb to drop on the rampaging army. The sequence is so lushly produced, with great stakes, great special effects. It's everything I enjoy about traditional Hollywood blockbusters. In terms of vibes and production values, there's not a whole lot of distance between this and the James Cameron Avatar movies. An Avatar sequel would almost absolutely feature a big blowout hand-to-hand duel with the villain, so you get one here as well. Regala is pleasantly reactive, one of those few instances where the combos the game goes so far out of its way to teach you actually do come in handy, though perhaps not quite as handy as explosive-tipped spears. What a movie cannot offer is a choice of what to do with Regala once the boss fight is over. There's not a lot of player choice in Forbidden West, but what there is does feel impactful. In terms of plot, I feel it almost makes more sense for Regala to die. It's her culture. Sparing her in the first place is part of the whole beef with Hikaru that she has. She has done much and learned little. She is not repentant in the least. But I wanted to see more of her character, so I spared her. She becomes part of the climactic roundup of side characters, all your many companions, Tilda, Silence, the whole gang. She doesn't fit in with them very well, and even she feels as if killing her would have made more sense. But having a chance to actually hash it out with her and hear her side of things is very welcome. To equalize the outcomes between the choices, she still doesn't make it all the way into sequel territory. Her big moment of the climax comes at the end, where she sacrifices herself to save the rest of the team. So her integration with the larger ensemble isn't ultimately much of an issue, because by the time you get her, it's pretty late in the game for a loyalty quest of her own anyway. After all, you've probably already done at least 4. A lot of what makes Aloy special within the setting isn't that she is herself special, it's that she can see the world of technology in a way that others can't because of her focus headset thing. This was fine for the first game, but there's simply no way for her to remain the only person with this special knowledge, as other characters learn the same lore via exposition that she had to learn the hard way. So the home base you clear out for housing Gaia becomes, in essence, the Aloy Academy for the technologically deprived. Everyone gets a focus and spends the hours that you're not together catching up with Aloy's level of knowledge so that they can discuss the situation without needing constant asides that would be redundant for the player. It comes more naturally for some than others. Erend particularly struggles quite a bit. His whole thing is mostly comedy. He likes to drink and fight, not sit there doing tutorials for holograms, but the punchline is that he eventually figures out how to navigate to the part of the archive labeled heavy metal music, and that makes it all worthwhile for him. Varl has a more complex arc. While it was suggested in earlier dialogue from last game that Varl, like many others, had a bit of a crush on Aloy, here he's given his own love interest in a much greater degree of personal autonomy than he had had before. He seems like someone really coming into his own, and having his own focus puts him on much more even footing with Aloy. Zoe, his girlfriend, is one of the Utaru. She's the least familiar with any of this high-technology stuff, but picks up on it the fastest. She is the most intellectually curious of the companions. What's dramatically interesting is how Zoe integrates this new knowledge with her cultural beliefs rather than just paving them over. Knowing that the Utaru land gods are machines does not actually diminish their significance to her and her people. They still create the abundance on which her society depends. They still live in a kind of symbiosis with organic nature. They still hold the same symbolic significance. So her loyalty quest has you going out and freeing a few land gods who have become broken or trapped over time, stuck on high ridges, buried under rubble in the middle of a lake, preyed upon by more aggressive machines. Aloy is a dedicated atheist as far as the customs and cultures of her world are concerned. Her interactions with Zoe kind of challenge some of her rough edges on these issues. Helping repair one of the land gods is how they became friends in the first place anyway, after Varl brings Zoe into Aloy's social circle to begin with. Varl himself gets no loyalty quest, however, because he is destined to die. The Zeniths kill him in a moment of what would otherwise be a major triumph over Hephaestus. I loved this plot beat because it's not the safe Disney-esque choice to make. It's not what the T for teen vibe sometimes suggests. And it takes all the independent character development Varl had gone through so far and leverages it for a sense of genuine loss. Losing a sycophant is a lot easier than losing an equal, losing a friend, especially one who is finding his own way in the world so well. Of course, this also incorporates the obvious subsequent plot beat that Zoe is having his child anyway. Gotta have that thread for Horizon 3. But as cliché as that is, Zoe is vivid enough of a character to sell it, grounded enough for her grief and hope to come across as human and sympathetic. This is why Erend is needed as a comedic contrast. His loyalty mission is more structural. It can only be resolved by doing all the rebel strongholds and outposts. This way, the player is directed to follow the Sons of Prometheus subplot to its conclusion, even if they don't feel like doing other open-world checklists like the survey drones. There are 2 other primary companions, plus Beta, who come from the new tribes and represent their perspectives. Gatalo is one of Hikaro's top marshals, but he loses an arm in the battle where you cross the border. This makes him less of a person in the eyes of his people, not the warrior he once was. His arc is one where he goes from feeling diminished by his injury to feeling empowered by it. No, he is not as strong as he used to be. The wound has forced him to become stronger. Like Aloy, he is a loner and reluctant to accept help, which creates a fun friction between the two early on. He is not an easy adopter of the Focus technology, but he eventually learns about old-world prosthetics, and his loyalty quest involves sending Aloy out to scavenge some of the parts for him so he can build a new arm for himself. What's clever about it is how this subplot resolves. Of course, there's the battle where he tests out the arm, where he is enhanced by it physically, but this is not a strength that matters to him in the end. He chooses not to wear the prosthetic outside of occasions where it's truly necessary because, culturally, it is so important to him that his power comes from within rather than without. His emotional healing is demonstrated in his ability to both embrace a prosthetic solution and also to accept his disability as part of him that matters, a part of what makes him the warrior he demands of himself. Alva, by contrast, is a nerdy tech girl, fatally soft according to every one of Cthulhu's values. She also already has a focus, but it's one of the older models that the Quen use, not capable of accessing the full range of data available. So on the one hand, she has this incredible pool of what's essentially forbidden knowledge for the Quen to drink deeply from at the Gaia base, and on the other hand, there's the awareness that comes with it that she will never happily reintegrate into the Quen's superstitious, zealous layers of information security. Her side quest is one of the best ones. It has her tracking down the work of an old world CEO she once venerated, a woman who created an agricultural system that could mean everything to Alva's people back home. She learns that, like the other Zeniths, this CEO made rash and selfish choices that led to people dying and suffering. As a player, you get to see her go through a whole arc of emotion similar to what Aloy went through in the first game, from the sense of wonder derived from these fragments of a gone-away world, to understanding the bitter disappointment of why that world went away, to the determination necessary to embrace this world as a second chance. It's also by far the most scenic among them. It's a long climb to the top of one of San Francisco's tallest towers, trying to find the remnants of the dead woman's office somewhere in the executive suites that loom in skeletal decay over the old downtown. Having Aloy there to talk it through with allows Alva to seem more real than her character archetype would suggest. She's a grounded human character, and not just her initial constellation of tropes. No matter if it's the main plot, the side quests, or the companion subplots, the quality of writing remains the same. Not perfect, not innovative or novel, but competent and vivid throughout. It is exactly what it sets out to be, no more, no less. In a world where the finished project can often be so much less than what it set out to be, this is something to be admired. To understand what's special about this kind of omnipresent sense of professional curation, it's useful to consider how the game might be without it, if the same amount of money went towards something ultimately vapid and artless. The foundation of so much of the game is Aloy as player-protagonist. Her personality, driven by consistently written dialogue edited for cohesion, her customizability of not just mechanical approach, but aesthetics potentially costumed in dozens of creative ways, and most of all, her performance, provided by veteran voice actor Ashley Birch. In my early 20s, one of my cousins introduced me to Birch's first claim to fame, a YouTube show called Hey Ash, What You Playin'? YouTubers don't often get to co-star besides folks like Lance Reddick and Angela Bassett, especially in the lead role with the Hollywood stars in the supporting cast. Talent, of course, is part of that, but another component is that initially, neither Sony nor Birch quite knew how big of a hit they had on their hands with Zero Dawn. In a 2021 interview with Games Radar, Birch said, quote, "When The Last of Us 2 audition was rolling out, I knew exactly how monumental that project would be. But with Horizon, I got sent lines for this character and I wasn't sure what it was for. I assumed that Aloy was probably going to be the protagonist because the script had choice wheel options in it, but I had no idea that it was going to be as beautiful as it was. Then, when I went into a recording session, my director said, 'Oh, hey, we have the gameplay footage for the E3 demo. Do you want to see it?' And my jaw was on the ground. I was recording these lines in isolation, so when I saw the footage of Aloy sneaking through the grass, taking down Watchers, and then fighting the Thunderjaw, I was absolutely flabbergasted. I was like, oh my god, this is a huge deal." End quote. To Sony's immense corporate pleasure, it was an extremely huge deal. On the subject of Forbidden West, Birch said, quote, "I can't say a lot, but I will say that I really do think that all of the things that people loved about Zero Dawn, the gorgeous world, the immersive story, the awesome gameplay, Forbidden West is just more and better. The new areas that Aloy is traveling to, the tribes that she's meeting, and the story that unfolds. I got a primer on it all before recording for the game, where the writing team took me through the arc of the story, and it was like being a kid at a campfire. I'm just so excited for it. I'm also a fan, so I'll be in recording sessions and we'll be recording a scene and I'm like, I can't wait to do this fight, or I can't wait to explore this area. So yeah, I really think that people are going to enjoy it. End quote. It feels kind of unusual to read this kind of interview where the performer is also such a video game person to begin with. I feel Birch's enthusiasm is both warranted and infectious. She is an artist contributing to the art of the whole, and the other multimedia disciplines that go into the art of it are equally impressive. But this is thinking of Forbidden West as art. To Sony, it is intellectual property, and since it's their property, they are, I guess, entitled to deface it as they see fit. In a leaked internal test, Aloy's character model was rigged with AI to give real-time, off-the-cuff responses. The result is, and I say this with all the critical professionalism I can muster, utter fucking bullshit. It is a wild example of how a company, by failing to understand its product as an artistic work, can creep ever closer to strangling the golden goose. Horizon Forbidden West is an accumulation of thousands of creative choices where most of those choices were clever and good. Proactive ideas with thought and emotion behind them. Games succeed by artistic intentionality, by having actual creative vision. What if someone's answering machine could banter with you? Has neither. It is a dead end of banality, where you can ask the machine anything you want and get a weird, uncanny, generic answer about it. Personality in a fictional character is due to authorship, driven by performance. It is an act of communication where even a story about robot dinosaurs is actually about other, deeper things, thanks to the meaning injected into it. AI can only ever do the robot dinosaur part. It can do that part fine, that's why no one is objecting to AI powering the behavior of enemies within the game, or the way light reflects off of surfaces in real time. These are the processes of the art that both can and should be automated. The storytelling is categorically not one of those things. The vision is not. Otherwise you get something bizarre, soulless, but unmistakably within the brand umbrella like that test sequence. Birch herself responded in a video on her own social media where she said, quote, I feel worried not because the technology exists, not even because game companies want to use it. Of course they do. They always want to use technological advancements. I just imagine a video like this coming out that does have someone's performance attached to it, that does have someone's voice or face or movement. And the possibility that if we lose this fight, that person would have no recourse. They wouldn't have any protections, any way to fight back. And that possibility, it makes me so sad it hurts my heart. It scares me. I love this industry and this art form so much, and I want there to be a new generation of actors. I want there to be so many more incredible game performances. I want to be able to continue to do this job. If we don't win, the future is really compromised. End quote. The deeply ironic thing about this is, of course, that this anxiety that our future is already fatally compromised is the entire thematic heart of the Horizon setting. It's what makes the games feel cathartic, having that sense of fear and anxiety about the future articulated and taken to its logical, speculative conclusions, like science fiction has done since its earliest days. But we live, increasingly, in a world too absurd to effectively satire. While I've been writing this section over the last day or so, an article came out that is completely indistinguishable from any of the fiction written in universe for Horizon. From CBS on May 18th, 2025, quote, People thought flip-flop and Hawaiian shirt-wearing tech billionaire Palmer Luckey, 32, was nuts when he launched defense product startup Endureal Industries. There hadn't been a new company in the defense industry in any significant way since the end of the Cold War, but Luckey had his own vision for the future of warfare, one with autonomous, AI-powered weapons and a different business model than the 5 prime defense contractors in the US. I've always said we need to transition from being the world police to being the world gun store, he said. Luckey does not believe the US should be sending its military to other countries. Instead, he says, American products should go overseas. I think that's one of the reasons that autonomy is so powerful. Right now, there are so many weapon systems that require manning, he said. You know, if I can have one guy command and controlling 100 aircraft, that's a lot easier than having a pilot in every single one, and puts a lot fewer American lives at risk. Autonomy does not mean remote control. Once an autonomous weapon is programmed and given a task, it can use artificial intelligence for surveillance or to identify, select, and engage targets. No operator needed. The Secretary General of the United Nations has called lethal autonomous weapons politically unacceptable and morally repugnant. Some international groups have referred to lethal autonomous weapons as killer robots. If I'm going to argue with them, I usually poke it, Lucky said. I'm like, okay, so do you think NATO should be armed with squirt guns or slingshots? As with many AI systems, some people also worry about what happens if the artificial intelligence goes rogue. I would say that it is something to be aware of, but in the grand scheme of things to be afraid of, there's things that I'm much more terrified of, Lucky said. I'm a lot more worried about evil people with mediocre advances in technology than AI deciding that it's going to wipe us all out. End quote. Like, fuck, right? Why even bother with dystopias or post-apocalypse in fiction when we all get the thrill and the privilege of going through it ourselves? In this way, it is the optimism of the Horizon games that becomes so artistically meaningful in a time like this. No longer having any value in warning about the future, it is, at least, able to commiserate with the present, to posit that it might not be okay for us, for now, but that one day there can be beauty and life again once all of our bullshit is finally ashes and dust. Of course, the thing about humanity is that there will always be assholes. Nothing you can do about it. But you can at least fight tooth and nail to make sure it's not the same assholes over and over again. This is what the Burning Shores expansion is all about, taking place in Los Angeles as you track down the final member of the Zenith group while he creates a cult of personality among the stranded Quen down south. Launder is not nearly as intricate a villain as Tilda, but that's his charm. He's just unrepentantly in love with himself in the most obnoxious of ways. You visit his original company, Heaven Sent, a space conglomerate which pulled asteroids into stable orbit around the Earth so that they could be mined. Someone had to provide the kind of materials people like Pharaoh needed to build their death machines, and Londra happily did. But it wasn't enough for him to be rich. He had to go Hollywood about it, using his wealth to produce a minor media empire and marrying the star of his Dinosaur Hunter movies. The Pangea movie thing is actually a really good joke, drawing comedic attention to how absurd Aloy's whole life has been, how she is still, herself, a pulp adventure protagonist no matter how much gloss is applied on top. Evelyn, Launder's long-dead wife, kind of haunts the background of much of the DLC. The Pangea movies were very popular, and the Disneyland equivalent of this version of Los Angeles is themed after them. There's a big DLC-wide puzzle challenge where you have to find 5 collectible toys in 5 tightly locked locations, each one providing an answer to the Dino Trivia Challenge. It's silly, it's completely optional, but it does provide a face paint option for Aloy that lets her adopt Evelyn's costume in addition to her action star role. Evelyn's house is out in the ruins of the Hollywood Hills, the mansion where she waited to see the world die after Londra left her behind. Which is something Londra, like Tilda, would prefer to relitigate now that they are more god than human. As villains in the main campaign, the other Zeniths couldn't really be bothered to engage with local cultures at all. They just killed them when convenient and ignored them when it wasn't. Londra left the main group because he figured that godlike powers were largely useless if one can't be worshipped for them. The Quen, since they already give spiritual significance to the executives of old, were such easy targets for him. His whole indoctrination process is absolutely fantastic. He doesn't have to use fancy brainwashing machines, though he does own them. He uses them sometimes, later on. No, all he has to do is flex his millennia-in-the-making talent for public relations. A hollow of a glitzy Hollywood party plays while he gregariously says, "Let me introduce you to a few of my friends." He invites you to sit down with his hollow in a big leather chair, as equals, almost, while he tells you about his storied life. He does everything possible to make a cult inductee feel seen, validated, invited into a world of glamour the likes of which they have literally never known. His actual plan is to irradiate the whole region with a hastily built rocket ship with which he will leave this twice-doomed Earth. He'll take a brainwashed few as sycophantic worshippers. Everyone else gets left to die. And of course he has to replace Evelyn. He's gotten nearly all the Quen women who come to him to rehearse and deliver some of his dead wife's old movie dialogue, and only when Aloy shows up to spoil the whole thing for him does he find the one who's got old-world Hollywood talent. He could not fully control his real wife back in the day, but this fake wife he's trying to cast he can make into whoever he likes, someone who will never disagree, someone who can be discarded if that ever changes. He is just so absolutely awful, and in such a very particular Los Angeles kind of way. Even his AI would rather be destroyed by Aloy than spend more years in his service. The thing literally begs Aloy for oblivion rather than stand in her way. It also makes Aloy and her new companion, Seika, perfect foils for him as a villain. Uncontrollable women with a moral imperative, that's like his least favorite thing, and here are two. So not only is Evelyn and her fictional character a kind of sarcastic echo of Aloy, Aloy, in return, is Evelyn's revenge and judgment of Londra made manifest. It might not be revolutionary storytelling by any degree, but that kind of thematic layering is a lot more than most games would bother with. Especially in terms of DLC, which sometimes feels a little more relaxed with their writing in many open-world titles. Burning Shores, however, doesn't relax anything. By the time it gets to its climax, it's ready to present the most impressive action sequence in the entire franchise so far. In the many in-between hours, however, there is time to really enjoy the work put into this new region of the game. It's larger than any other single region from the main campaign, like the deserts around Las Vegas or the Isle of Spires. It presents a predominantly urban region, addressing a lot of my frustration with how there aren't as many impressively post-apocalyptic skylines as there were in Zero Dawn back in its main campaign. The scale is very condensed, like Horizon's world always is, but it's still large enough to present distinct neighborhoods and recognizable landmarks. There's Santa Monica and the big Ferris wheel, the Hollywood sign, of course, but also the mansions of the hills. There's the Capitol Records building by the freeway and the clustered downtown skyscrapers. Even ruined and overgrown with 1,000 years of change, the personality of Los Angeles as a city is meaningfully different from what was done with San Francisco. Having grown up in Southern California, I can absolutely attest to how they captured the vibe of it with everything from architecture to flora to the quality of light of the sunrises and sunsets. The quality control, as ever, is just immaculate. My only complaint is that the side questing is just not as interesting as it was in the Frozen Wilds. The Banuk were a more compelling culture, the new machines were better and harder, and the environment of the Wyoming mountains felt more climactically hostile. I think Burning Shores focuses on the Quen so much because they'll be relevant for the next game. They come from across the ocean, and at the end of the DLC, Sylens suggests some future plot points that will make up the next main questline, some of which are international destinations. There's one subplot with them that I really do like involving an overzealous compliance officer who functions kind of like inquisitors or secret police among the Quen. Aloy exposes his secrets, how his incompetence has led to both accidental deaths and murder, and he gets chewed out by the Admiral. It's a good window into what's kind of cancerous at the heart of Quen society, its strict orthodoxies and regimentation. But if that's not your speed, there's also buried treasure. You literally can't have beach adventure without buried treasure. I think that's a law somewhere. Vista points are retooled into a kind of sightseeing tour for your flying mount, which doesn't really make them any more interactive, but does at least inject a little novelty. The map is just packed to bursting with small activities, and then also some really high-production versions of familiar activities. Its one traditional ruin puzzle, for example, is layered with 2 puzzle boxes on top of each other, plus a bonus side quest and a combat challenge. The new Cauldron is a massive, partial ruin filled with lava, with brand new puzzle elements like a floating platform that can be guided by the player. It's more scenic, more difficult, more impressive than that of the main game. If the problem with Forbidden West is that there is too much of it already, then perhaps it can be forgiven for adding even more if the more is actually better. Even where it's mostly the same, I found myself really enjoying it. The essential gameplay loop of Horizon Forbidden West is still so deeply satisfying, arguably more so with the endgame equipment where elemental conditions can be applied freely and easily. 110 hours of this game is a lot. But I can't say I haven't thought about doing a New Game Plus in a few years when I've had a chance to forget some of it. Plus, the DLC for both Zero Dawn and Forbidden West are important interstitial chapters. There's a huge amount of Forbidden West's main plot that wouldn't hit as well or make as much sense if it hadn't have been for the focus on Hephaestus in the Frozen Wilds DLC. The climax of the main campaign had dropped the new villain, Nemesis. On the planet they fled to, the Far Zeniths had attempted to make digital copies of themselves. They failed, and these discarded selves were smashed together into a kind of amalgamated ball of hatred. This is Nemesis. The worst instincts, the foulest emotions, the deepest resentments that these people can muster embodied as a digital consciousness. It destroyed their colony, it forced them back to Earth, and that's what Londra and Tilda are so intent on fleeing. It was the thing that sent the extermination signal to Hades in the first place, triggering the derangement of the machines, setting in motion the plot of both games so far. Nemesis has been Silen's area of focus pretty much the whole time. That's the level he's been on, and the threat of it has driven his otherwise mysterious decisions. So Londra is important now within this DLC, but he will remain important because the next game's villain is also Londra, in a way. Zero Dawn's villain was a machine, cold and heartless, driven by programming. The second game's villains are human, manipulative and cruel, driven by emotion. The third game's villain will be both things at once, which is a clever way to escalate it all. A crowd pleaser must always strive to be bigger, better, more. It helps to map that out in advance, to leave room for that expansion process instead of accidentally leaving no room for growth. And it helps even more if you do it in a way that leaves the audience actually wanting more, even at the end of such a very long journey. There is one robot that's loomed over the games without ever appearing as an actual enemy, the Horus Automated Factory Platform. They are the enormous machines draped over mountains and encroaching on dead cities before they starved and stopped when the world was finally dead. I never really expected to have a Horus as an actual enemy either. They are just far too fucking big. It would be an enormous technical challenge to animate them. And yet, I think it's incredible that Guerrilla Games chose to attempt this not on some future title with beefier hardware, but as a grand finale for this one. Londra commandeering one of these things is only really possible because it's broken, the cooling system is completely trashed, and that leaves both a weakness to exploit in combat and dramatic stakes as he pilots the thing down to the ocean to cool it off. When God of War 3 was released on PlayStation 3, its enormous boss fights really pushed what was possible in terms of spectacle. While it sometimes feels like games aren't really making these enormous technical leaps as dramatically or as often these days, this is still a notable push forward into new, impressive territory, for the Horizon games at least. It's also probably some of the most fun I've had with a boss fight in these games. It genuinely blows Zero Dawn out of the water totally, and is considerably better in every respect than Tilda's fancy combat mech at the end of the main campaign for Forbidden West. It's a real blowout climax any way you look at it, the important thing mainly being that you look at it, because this is also representative of a truly colossal amount of time and money being spent to portray it so impressively. There are so many stages to the boss fight, beginning with tendrils, expanding out to an arena fight trying to expose its heat sinks on some of its legs, and to then climbing the metal devil and trying to find a way in, and then, at last, a confrontation with Londra himself in the control room that Pharaoh had once long ago designed into the thing. Londra's fight is the least interesting part for me, but his death is more satisfying and warranted than Tilda's. Destroying the Horus, for the player, is a thrilling accomplishment. For Aloy, it's also kind of a date. All throughout the DLC, she had been treating Seika a little differently than her other companions. There are a lot of characters that have a crush on Aloy to varying degrees, but she never warmed much to any of them the same way. She always seemed distant from any kind of romantic reciprocation. Seika, however, brings something to the table they do not. Big main character energy. She is brave, ethical, self-assured, intelligent, and adaptable. Everything Aloy values in herself, Seika embodies also. Being a chosen one sort of character, Aloy often assumes that she knows better than most people. There is an earned arrogance to her, an aloofness that comes with that. Seika is one of the first people she's met where she doesn't need to catch them up or take them out of their comfort zone to ask them to keep up with her. Seika just meets Aloy at that level every time, and so Seika is the only person she's ever invited for a ride on her giant mechanical bird, which, I promise, is not as suggestive as it sounds. This is another area where the digital acting is impressive. The two of them actually do have good chemistry, and their escalating flirtations are obvious to anyone paying attention. But the final choice of whether to act on those impulses is left, compellingly, up to the player. In an interview with Video Games Chronicle with narrative director Ben McCaw and lead writer Annie Catane, the interviewer asks which of these choices are canon. McCaw says, quote, "We strive to make them all fit in the realms of Aloy's psyche. If you really look at the other two, besides the one where she kisses Seika, they really are reflective of her journey in Forbidden West. They're really a continuation of a theme that we have in both games about her not being ready for various types of social contact because of her upbringing, but also because of the enormous challenges that she faces ahead. So for me, they're all viable, end quote. Katane then continues, quote, "We wanted to make sure that each of these choices is still in line with Aloy as a character and is still true to the story that it led up to that moment. So the feelings that she's developed for Seika, that's all still true, but just, whether the player thinks Aloy is ready to take that next step and have this romantic encounter, or whether Aloy isn't there yet, it's valid," end quote. I find this kind of approach fascinating because it allows for a continuation of how Aloy has been this whole time, aloof, uncertain, independent above all. To deny the kiss would absolutely be in canonical keeping with her established personality, but to be romantic instead, I think that fits better with who she newly becomes within Forbidden West, someone who reaches out, someone who connects, someone for whom being brave is less about slaying robots and more about trusting people not to hurt her. Just as fighting the Horus is a perfect climactic escalation of the combat, this romance is a climactic escalation of all Aloy has learned emotionally so far. Like I've been saying all along, emotion really is at the core of the setting, the heart of both games. If there is a moral to any of it, it's to value what you have in the time that you have it, to be willing to sacrifice for beauty or love. There's a log I found where a guy pens a brief eulogy to LA while the lights go out, the city burns, and the world comes to an end. The long-dead author, in his last moments, really came to appreciate the whole mess. It's charming and feels so relatable. I drove past someone taking a full-on shit on the sidewalk in broad daylight a couple days ago, and I still love living in the city. It is beautiful, it is special, even when it categorically isn't. I would hate to see it all go away, even if it did lead to cleaner sidewalks. One of the most hidden things in the main campaign is a door at the very bottom of the Gaia facility home base. It requires a code that has to be pieced together from extremely vague clues found throughout the facility, and only unlocked slowly as the main plot progresses. So what treasure does the vault hide? No weapon, no armor, just voices. The recorded hopes and dreams of the people that built the place and then died. The question they all died with was wondering if anything would ever come after, if this was truly the end of all things. But they chose optimism. They left the messages anyway. Aloy, and you the player by extension, are that hope coming to fruition. Their message to the future was the wish that there be a future, that one generation's stupidity would not ruin all life forever. And behold, it did not. Which is never a certain thing. It takes courage, it takes hope, it takes love. It means not letting the bastards get you down even when the consequences are achingly real. And that, ultimately, is the real crowd pleaser. Most people really want love to win, given the chance. Most people want to root for characters who are clever, kind, and brave, who are good friends, who know the worth of the world and its beauty. It's almost instinctive to be drawn to that kind of flame, especially when there is much darkness in the world outside of fiction. Forbidden West is a great game, an excellent story. It is thoroughly competent in every way. To achieve its super hit status, it needed one talent above all. It needed to know how to give the people what they want. People want sincerity. People want heart. And in that regard, it excelled beyond all the money that reflects off of every pixel. Thanks for watching.
Machines. Better be careful. Attach them. I can use them against it.
I'm Dr. Elizabeth Sobek. Thank you for completing the Vista Point tour. I hope it's given you a better idea of the work we do at Miriam Technologies, but more importantly, why it is so critical. As you've seen, life is fragile. And, as my mother once told me, it needs our support, our care, and our love to survive. I hope this message, which is the core of Miriam's mission, means as much to you as it does to me.
It does, Elizabeth.